This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic 2 by Matthew J. DiStefano. Ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about faith? In Heretic 2, I dive into LGBTQ affirmation, rejecting divine violence, and embracing universalism in a bold post-Christian perspective. If you're done with outdated dogma and want a justice-oriented, inclusive view of spirituality, then this book is for you. Get Heretic 2 wherever books are sold, and start rethinking faith today.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Hey, welcome back to the podcast, everybody. My name is Nat Turney. I don't know why I say it like that either. I like emphasized it. I'm the Nat Turney. I thought for a long time I should have gone into like the law.
Attorney at law.
Yeah, doesn't it?
Nat Turney at law.
The tagline sort of writes itself, doesn't it? He's Nat Attorney at law. I don't know. Just doesn't. Although the law, it's boring. So never mind. But hey, this is the podcast. I'm here with my brother John, and we're here with Bethany and a guest who we will introduce in a moment. But just wanted to shout out to John and Bethany. Say hi, y'all.
Hi, y'all.
Hi, y'all.
We're still trying to find our footing with the anyway. This is the podcast. Welcome to This Is Not Church. With our guest tonight, we have an awesome guy. His name is Pierce Alexander Marks. He's an Eastern Orthodox philosopher and photographer out of Washington. He holds an MA in philosophy, and his main research interests are in existential-metaethics, philosophy of religion, and confirmation theory. Believe we're here to talk about his new book called A New Way of Seeing, Meaning in Life, and it cut off halfway through the subtitle. Amazon sucks, dude. This is an unfinished work by our friend Pierce called A New Way of Seeing, Meaning in Life, and
it kind of peters out halfway through.
I hope that's not like a prophetic of like this is how the book goes. It really starts strong, but about halfway through, it just kind of just sort of trails off. What is the rest of that subtitle, man? I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me.
You're good. It's Meaning in Life in the Christian Vision of Nature.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Didn't want to. Of all the things I don't want to butcher, your name and the title of the book we're trying to help you promote. So, hey,
that's fine.
That's right. Without any further ado, welcome to the podcast. How are you, sir?
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it. I'm doing pretty good. I'm tired.
Yeah.
I'll probably be bumbling and incoherent through this interview, so be prepared.
Well, you'll be in good company. I mean, you've already seen how I bumble through introduction. So this is kind of how we roll. But you at least have an excuse.
Yeah, now I feel very comfortable.
Yeah, you should. That's what we try to do. We try to lower the bar significantly enough that people are like, there's no issue here, man. Don't feel bad. But you at least have an excuse. You guys, you have a new baby at home is what I heard.
Yeah, very fresh baby that won't stop screaming and crying and demanding milk. Yeah.
Oh, those are hard times.
So how fresh is the fresh baby?
He's 8 weeks old.
Woo,
yeah. So he's pretty fresh.
That's popping fresh.
He just got vaccinated. And so is screaming at the top of his lungs, angry that we allowed someone to put a needle in him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I have not slept very much.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to have those days are long behind me, but I remember I'm traumatized by a lot of it. I remember taking one of my kids in to get their first shots, and they got them with 4. I mean, they had They had 4. I'm like, how are you going to do this? And they brought 4, like 3 nurses and a doctor, and they tag team, leg, arm, bam. I'm like, I'm never doing that shit again.
That's crazy.
That's messed up. Oh. It was the 90s. What do we know?
And
the Stone Age.
We had a thing with our kids that anytime they got shots, we would go out for ice cream afterwards. So it was
100%,
a deal a little bit.
As much for me as for them, because I was usually, almost as traumatized as they were. But it's cool. Yeah, we're about to welcome our 4th grandchild on Wednesday. So 2 more days, and we're going to go meet this little girl that's been cooking for almost 10 months. So we're excited, man. Oh, it is. It's the best. Thank you. It's what's that old joke? It's like, this is the reward you get. Grandkids are the rewards you get for not murdering your children. I think there's a more polite way to put that. That's what essentially it boils down to is I allowed you to live. You reward me someday with babies that I don't have to raise. That's the ideal. That I just get to spoil and bounce around and sit home. So far it's been pretty good, but so hey, let's talk about what's going on, man. we like to start off these programs a lot of times, especially when somebody's coming to promote or talk about a book that is spiritual in nature. I like to talk about people's spiritual backgrounds a little bit. If you don't mind filling in some blanks for us, I know the bio says that you're Eastern Orthodox. I'd be curious to know if you've always been that way or if you been that way. That sounds weird. Have you always been that
Have
way?
I always been
Have
that
you always been
strange?
so afflicted?
Yeah.
Or was that something you came to? I'm just curious. Always curious about people's journey, how they get to where they are. So.
Yeah. So I guess my background, my religious and spiritual background, as baptized Catholic, grew up Catholic for the first 10 years of my life. Surprisingly, as a child, really enjoyed it. Not on like an intellectual level, but I just was very enraptured by the art of the Catholic Church. And then that was when the really bad Catholic sex scandals happened in the 90s. And my parents left Catholicism because of that and went to non-denominational evangelicalism. And I was homeschooled in a bunch of like fundamentalist evangelical groups in Southern California from about 10 to the end of high school. And that entire time, I hated these non-denominational churches and was very unhappy, even as like a 10 or 11-year-old. Just really didn't like it at all. And as I was a teenager, I never really fit in any of those spaces. There's always a lot of conflict. And I think being in those environments, as a teenager, I wouldn't say I lost my faith, but I definitely lost any confidence I had in the existence of God and Christianity in particular. And I'm trying to think of, I don't remember that time super well other than like the major things, but just really, really right-wing fundamentalist preaching at these churches that even as like a 14, 15-year-old put me off and without being able to articulate at the time really depressed me too. Like a lot of stuff about the rapture, the end of the world, how basically you have to be ready to kill all the liberals that are trying to do a one world government, and these weren't like cult churches. These were very mainstream churches in Southern California, like Calvary chapels. And then the schools I was in were affiliated with those types of churches. So it wasn't like I was in a strange, very small sect, like mainstream Southern California evangelicalism. And yeah, it just really put me off. But for some reason, I'm not exactly sure why. I really wanted there to be a God and really still loved Christianity. I just never was willing to like join the youth groups or be a part of those churches. I don't know why. I think some of it had to do with growing up Catholic and seeing the difference between like the high church art and kind of ethos and the low church. Again, the caveat is I don't think I could articulate any of that at the time. But some of my earliest memories are of like the beautiful stained glass windows and Stations of the Cross. And so as a teenager, I started having like a kind of an existential crisis about like the meaning of life, stuff like that. And that was all wrapped up with religion and what we would now call deconstructing, even though I don't think that was a word, 15, 16 years ago. And through that, towards the end of high school, I got into philosophy and theology, went to community college, studied philosophy there, and just from like about 16, 17, decided I would devote my life to finding some of these answers. And my goal was always to see if I could get back to God, see if I could get back to Christianity. So it was like a 10-year period until I was in my mid-20s that I did nothing but study and go to school for that stuff. And eventually, I wasn't a member of any churches or really a particular kind of Christian through that. But very slowly over a 10-year period, I ended up becoming Eastern Orthodox because of certain theological views that I had come to independently and then found that they resided in the Orthodox Church really well. And then once I found more about Orthodoxy, I was like, oh, okay, I'll join that. Not for any like particular reasons about like the history of the church or like its claims to be the one true church, but because the conclusions I had came to, they beat me to by a few thousand years. So
yeah. Yeah. I had a similar experience deconstructing before I knew what to call it. Being arrogant enough to think that I had actually come up with that term, because I was calling it deconstruction before I realized other people were doing it. I'm like, I've come up with a new thing. Well, first of all, no, I didn't. Derrida has been talking about it since however long he had been. It's not quite the same, but anyway, I started reading some books, and the thing I love about like reading outside of your, like, say, your prescribed reading list, right? There were books we were supposed to read, and then there was so all of a sudden most of these guys were citing people. I'm like, oh, so I remember reading a book by Baxter Kruger, and all of a sudden he's talking about Athanasius. I'm like, well, who is this Athanasius guy? I must read that. And so my reading list got really big, and I came to the conclusion, and I'm not sure if this was your conclusion either, but the evangelical church doesn't talk about those guys. And I'm in my 30s, and I'm just now going, there's an entire history of this church that I was never even made aware of. There are positions that church has held theologically that are apostolic and historic, and we would have been told they were all heretical, even though they were like, and I'm like, so I'm not a joiner. I'm probably never going to join another church again, but I've said for years that if I was going to join a church just based on theology, I'd be Orthodox. I mean, it aligns probably. I have issues with all churches. I have my issues with the Orthodox Church as well. They're not immune to problems, but theologically, I can go, yeah, I can get behind how they articulate the Trinity. I can get behind how they tend to articulate the atonement and things of that nature. Was that kind of your things? Like you come to these conclusions, like, okay, is there a way to talk about the atonement without using all this sacred violence language?
Yep.
That seems to pop up in all of, Western Christianity. Yeah,
that was a huge specific, like, gateway drug in. I started reading, there's the Resource Mon movement from the Anglicans in the 1960s and 70s, where they're trying to reclaim patristic texts and stuff and get everybody else to care again about them. And I was reading a lot of those authors, and they were quoting Athanasius, and that was like Athanasius's Incarnation of the Word was like the first patristic text I read, and reading it, I was like, oh yeah, this is not anything like the Christianity I grew up with in those churches. It's just a different beast, there's some overlap, but the stuff with like divine violence and essentially retribution from God punishing his own son to get even.
Yeah. It's
not really.
So much of it is nonsensical.
Yeah.
I mean, if you boil it down, if you do that sort of reductio ad absurdum, right? Like you reduce it to its most, basic points, the absurdity of it becomes very clear. It's like, none of this makes any sense, but for years and years and years, it just was my reality, at least how it was articulated. So I didn't question it until I did. And then once it's like John and I've said for a long time, like once you see stuff, like you can't unsee it. Like I can no longer. And so I remember reading, I started reading Girard quite a bit, and I'm reading, and I'm starting to really started wrestling with this idea of violence quite a bit. That was one of the first, like you, sort of gateway drug. Is why is so much of Western Christianity comfortable with, not just comfortable with, but at times seeming to promote and sacralize violence that Jesus seems to abhor and denounce at every step, and yet somehow, the early church, I would say the first couple hundred years of the church, obviously nonviolent until we get Constantine, So, but. I'm not really sure where I was going with that. You're not the only one rambling.
Well, and it's that dominant narrative that has been a part of our churches for so long that oftentimes, if that's what you're raised in, that's all you know. That it's so hard to see scripture outside of that dominant narrative, and it takes somebody either throwing a stick into the spoke and making you have to come to a complete stop for you to even slightly understand that there could be other ways of seeing scripture. I think for a lot of people, it's not just the, atonement theories that get people there. I think it's also people's understanding of hell that will get people starting on that whole cycle of like questioning everything. Like, wait, what was I handed? And why was I handed it like that? And is it actually true to scripture? Evolution is another one. There's just women in ministry. I mean, there's so many things that make people step back and question, or they dig deeper into what they know because it's too scary to question, which I understand that too. Or they leave it all together. But I love how through your questions and through your, you had like such a beautiful foundation in the Roman Catholic Church. And then to experience something that was so opposite of that, and for your soul to kind of become depleted in a way, or like, this isn't right. This is actually not good for my spirit. And then to like go down that journey and really seek it out for yourself. That's so brave of you. And then to come where you're at right now. And then not just like to get to where you are as an Eastern Orthodox, but also to keep digging into those spaces by writing more philosophy and writing books for people to understand what you've come to understand. Like, I just love that you never gave up. It's pretty great.
Yeah, thank you. I am so brave. I'm such a hero for all this. So, and thank you that you recognize that. Yeah.
You got it. You got it.
No, I mean, that's like a big passion of mine. I mean, I have no pretenses in my life to ever like innovate anything in philosophy or anything like that, but just to be able to hand people, to be that lifeline for people, to an external lifeline that somebody like stuck in fundamentalism can maybe see my book or see something I've done and just a little hint of something different, a different way of being Christian that might be more liberating. Because without that lifeline, without, like you were saying about having like a footnote quoting Athanasius, or for me having a run-in with a particular Presbyterian pastor who was really into the church fathers that taught me how to read them, like without an external lifeline, I would have just been lost forever. I would have been, and then I would have ended up burning out and frankly becoming an agnostic that's absolutely hostile to any form of Christian religion, which I take to be an equally sad move personally, to when it's reactionary like that, at least to staying fundamentalist.
Well, when both ends of the spectrum are presented that way, like you can either, if I'll tell you right now, if I'm given the choice right now, and it's this binary choice of back to fundamentalism or atheism, I'm an atheist.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
I completely agree.
I can sleep at night on one side. On the other side, I know where the bodies are buried there. I know where the harm is. But when you, like your opening chapter, you talk about a new moral paradigm. I was curious if you could maybe give us the Cliff Notes version of, because I think this is one of those places where, especially, and we pick on Western evangelical. I'm sorry that I feel like I can, because that's my tribe. So yeah. I'm gonna be the most critical of my own people. I have experience in that, but the way we were always raised to think about morality, I think is actually very harmful and damaging, versus maybe what you're talking about in your book. So it's sort of open-ended. Yeah.
Yeah. This is something I think is really important. And to preface what I'm about to say, my views in this book are not really mine. And I'm basically just plagiarizing and ripping off the vast majority of Christian theology and history. And so the position I'm about to describe, what might sound radical to some people, especially those we like to pick on like evangelicals, it really is like the mainstream view. Even today, in terms of institutional dogmatic theology, even though it's not very well practiced right now in the modern world. But essentially, the point of my book and the point of a lot of my work is not looking at morality and ethics from the point of view of like ethical systems about right and wrong, and rules and principles, but boiling down to like the fundamentals. What is value? What is goodness? What is, the point of doing anything, the point of living? These really fundamental questions. And when you dig into those, and when you look at what the Christian tradition has said about those very fundamental, what you would call metaethical questions about the very nature of goodness, the nature of moral value, of human dignity, and like things like meaning in life. What you find the Christian tradition saying is that all of those things are ultimately one in God. And God, since he is omnipresent, not because he's physically everywhere, but because all things exist in him, all things thus partake in him, and God is everywhere, and he's omnipresent in the sense that he's transfused through all of reality. And seeing the world through that moral vision, when you dig into those questions and see the Christian tradition and what it says, it essentially opens your eyes to see everything that exists is fundamentally good. Everything that exists is fundamentally beautiful. Evil is just a corruption of the things that are good, and God is everywhere. And that kind of moral paradigm, you see it in the Christian tradition, and it feels very foreign because the way we currently think about morality, and like if you want to talk about like the crisis of meaning that some people say we're going through, we could talk about that too. But our current way of seeing morality is that there's good and there's evil. There's God and the nice things of heaven, and then there's this shitty earth that is disposable and we throw away. And there's a strong like dualistic binary in modern Christianity. And outside of sort of that dualistic binary, it's basically just nihilism in the popular culture. So that nothing has value, there's no real such thing as beauty or goodness or anything like that. And so when you become aware of the Christian moral paradigm and compare it to the other alternatives available in our culture, what I would say like a bastardized Christian moral paradigm where it's basically like dualism, where it's like there's a couple things that are good, God and the angels and the saved, and everything else sucks and is basically of the devil, or it's just without value at all, or a sort of nihilism. That's overall the point of like the beginning chapters, is prepping people for contrasting the historical Christian view of beauty and goodness and wonderful things are all around us and are not the exception to the rule, but the rule that you can't escape. And the exception to the rule is when we screw things up and start destroying good things. And so overall, the book is like essentially like a battle of these different paradigms or ways of seeing the world and digging into these fundamental questions. And the first few chapters really just prepare in a very tedious way that when I reread it, it's like, oh my God, this is like baby level stuff. I would hate reading my own book. That it prepares you like, what's the idea of like a moral paradigm or a moral way of seeing the world, like the glasses you see the world through, how you're disposed to evaluate certain things. And yeah, so that's kind of like an overview or introduction to like how the book kind of proceeds and what its target is through the first chapter.
Well, I got the sense too that, there's, and this is something I've bumped my head against for several years now. And again, the modern Western evangelical view of this is hyper individualized. It's I was raised to believe I needed to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And that would, and then to get there, I had to pretty much go through this obstacle course of good and bad. And it was there was never any talk about ethics. There was never any really conversation about what, how we're supposed to sort of walk in the world and do it was always about the things you were supposed to and the things you were not supposed to do. It was all boiled down to very, very binaries, you don't drink, smoke, or chew, or go with girls that do, you don't dance, you don't listen to secular music, there was very little in the way of, hey, as Christians, this is our responsibility to, not just ourselves and our community, but to the world. Because it was all, as you said, I grew up also in the shadow of like Hal Lindsey and Late Great Planet Earth. It was all going to burn, baby.
Well, yeah.
And because
of that, there was no stewardship.
Yeah.
Of this planet.
And that's the true. That to me, it was like the true nihilism. Was it's all going to go away anyway. Nothing really matters. We can't really fix this particular train. It's going off the rails. The best you can do is save yourself, and hope that when the rapture comes, you get snatched away and don't have to endure Armageddon. That's a very, in my view, a very self-centered view of this, of something that should be more expansive and should be more, should have a larger impact on the world. I don't know if that was your experience or not inside of that version of Christianity.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like you said, I think that's ultimately a form, I guess technically it wouldn't be nihilism, but in my mind, that's such a crappy way of viewing the world and so obviously not in tune with like what human beings actually desire that it's essentially equivalent to nihilism, in that I would rather just be dead than believe that everything's just going to burn. There's no real value in anything that exists now. So ultimately being like Nietzsche or being that sort of, late great planet Earth Christian, in my mind is equivalent in terms of their value. But, the other thing that you were mentioning, that might kind of go into answering how you originally framed the question a little bit better is the insistence that you're talking about like rules and essentially regulations and things like that when you're in these in these environments and evangelical sects. But if you notice how I just described my book and I described like the Christian moral paradigm, I didn't say anything about rules. I didn't say anything about staunch moral principles that like you might find in like Kant's writing or something like that. Or even in the secular version, like with utilitarianism and the other ethical theories, like I have said not a single thing about a general rule saying you have a staunch duty to do this. You have or you're not allowed to do that, something like that, right? The fundamental starting point in Christian ethics is not rules, which can seem like arbitrary divine commands or laws, but is the notion of the intrinsic value of things, the intrinsic beauty of things or goodness of things. And you build ethics from there. So that ethics isn't a system of rules that basically rigidly govern your life for no real reason, it seems like, but is an organic way of deliberating about how we respect the things that have inherent value, how we promote the well-being of all of creation and all the good and beautiful things in creation, including ourselves, our societies, and nature. Like what you were saying, we have a responsibility to these things because, not just because God says so, but because they are themselves inherently good and beautiful. Or like John was saying, the idea of stewardship is that there are good things that we are tasked to take care of, not just for arbitrary laws or commands, but because those things are themselves valuable and good and beautiful.
Well, and there is a certain amount of utilitarianism in that, isn't there? I mean, there is a certain amount of pragmatism in that. That's why, I listen to a lot of people who are self-described secular humanists, and, they're always accused, well, you don't have how could you have a moral framework without God? And they're like, because I recognize the value and the beauty, like it's literally what you just said, because I recognize that there's inherent value, or at least I need to believe there's inherent value and worth in all things. And I have a responsibility to safeguard those things. The golden rule is a pretty damn good rule. We didn't come up with it. It's been around for a long time. So you can what I like about what you're saying is, I guess what I'm getting at is that moral framework or that sort of moral paradigm doesn't have to be exclusive to Christianity. You can go, hey, this is a framework that works inside of Buddhism. This is a framework that works inside of atheism even. This is a framework that says, the opposite of what a lot of Christians say, which is everything's crap until God redeems it, versus actually, no, everything's inherently good. And it's even better when we align it with the things of God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The only thing that needs to be redeemed for most of the patristic authors is us, because we are actively destroying ourselves and the other things that are good and beautiful. Nature doesn't necessarily need to be redeemed, except insofar as we, or historically other supernatural intelligent beings that are dysfunctional, have created disease within the natural created order. It's not because nature is in somehow like the product of an evil God or is itself without value or is evil. It's because we have fundamentally screwed things up. We're the problem. Was Bethany going to say something? I wanted to hear what she was going to say.
Oh, I was just going to say, it makes me think of like Jesus calling people to repentance. It's like an invitation not to a list of more rules to follow or different rules to follow. It's like an invitation of an entire mind change, a mind shift, a total different perspective on how you see yourself and the world around you, which, it makes me think of what you're talking about is there's this woman I've read a number of times, Sally McFaig, and she talks about this sense of like God, like the universe or creation is held in the womb-like love of God, like that the entire notion of all of it is one of complete and utter love and acceptance and grace. And so then if that's where we start from, in a Christian world or whatever, in a biblical world, I would say from a Genesis 1 and 2 framework, then we move from the goodness of all things instead of from the brokenness of all things. Not to negate the brokenness or believe it doesn't exist, because it does, but that's not where it ends. And that's not where we focus all of our time and attention. But how do you so how do you say this Christian moral vision that you talk about in the book? You talk about like having to truly see through that lens, but how does a person get there with all the biases that we have that kind of cloud that lens and all of our experiences and upbringing? How do you think that somebody can get to that place of being able to see the intrinsic value of what it means to be human?
Yeah. Ultimately, my real answer is that I have no idea. I've been teaching philosophy and trying to get this into people's heads of all ages for a while now, and I have no idea. This is not something that can be produced through pure rational argumentation. I think certain stumbling blocks to seeing the world in this way can be removed through like rational argument. I think you can describe this way of seeing the world in very compelling, nice ways that show how attractive it is. And that's overall like my goal in the book. But how you actually get somebody to calibrate their emotions and their convictions that the world isn't, that everything they see around them is inherently good, that every blade of grass, every fundamental particle, every line of ants, every water molecule is itself something to be wondered over and delighted in and loved. I don't know how you get someone to that point. I have had experiences where once I understood that framework and I gave myself permission to believe it, that it felt like my heart opened up and it was like something I always knew. And it was like a moment of clarity that and to this day, I keep having increased moments of clarity of how lovely and beautiful and wonderful every positive existence in this world is, that the cosmos is in itself, right? But how to get somebody to that point, I really don't know and can't give advice on like that emotional or psychological component. Other than what I kind of outline in the book is like a couple practical steps, which I don't even have my book in front of me, so I'm not sure what order I say these in. But it's things that like some people call like mindfulness techniques. They obviously can't get you there because mindfulness, when your mind is empty and you have no philosophical ideas going on, mindfulness isn't going to help you. But when you pair it with like philosophical reflection and you sit around and you just really take in the world, you meditate on what you're seeing in front of you. You get to know the plants and the animals and the people around you. You learn more about science, about history, about these things, and you meditate on reality itself and get to know it with all of your senses, including your intellectual faculties. And you force yourself to put aside your own self-interest. And you just let the things be what they are. I think, at least I hope, that when you practice that sort of mindfulness, most of us, our hearts already will move out in love towards those things. Part of me is like, well, what about the psychopath, right? What about the serial killer who for some reason their heart really wants to kill and destroy? I don't know. But I think at least most of us have this innate desire for the good and the beautiful, that if we just allowed ourselves to be in the present moment and not constantly be thinking about our self-interest and what the goals we personally, individually want to accomplish, the things we need to get done, and start taking on what I call like the external point of view, or some other philosophers call it a universal point of view, where we try to see reality not just from our limited perspective, but as it is in itself, as far as we can. I think that naturally opens up the heart. And at least I hope it does. If it doesn't, then all of Christian psychology is basically false, because everything, and Greek philosophy too, everybody just assumes that human beings already want the good, that we're just ignorant of it. So hopefully that's true. And we do, if we could clear away obstacles, we would be open to loving in this way, right?
I like how you wrote how a professor once told you philosophers shouldn't expect to prove their theories, but take students on a journey through different ways of seeing the world. And I think what you just said is totally true of that, like cultivating spaces of curiosity and wonder and being able just to sit in a space without trying to have to define it or create some sort of formula to understand it, but just allowing the experience to be what it is from that standpoint of goodness. I don't know. That's really impactful.
Yeah, I think he's absolutely right. That I'll mention him by name now because I don't think I credit him in the book, but he recently died. It was Lawrence Pasternak, Dr. Lawrence Pasternak. And he was actually one of the world's greatest Kant scholars, who basically, essentially, because he's a Kantian, boils down to he doesn't think we can actually know like what true metaphysical reality is like, independent of our observations of it. But he didn't think that was a bad thing, because basically what a philosopher is meant to do is I'm presenting you a way of seeing the world, and you spend some time to dwell on it. You spend some time internalizing it and testing it out and see how it works out. And for him, and even though we had very different backgrounds, he really taught me and some of my other grad school cohort that wonder was like the starting place of good philosophy. And as I matured and learned more, then I realized that wonder is, as many of the great saints say, like wonder is the beginning of faith. Wonder is also the beginning of not just like intellectual inquiry, but the beginning of love, the beginning of faith, the beginning of the spiritual journey. You can't come to even believe in God without first marveling and wondering at existence itself. And I think that's the last chapter of the main text of my book is basically arguing that, contrary to popular belief, the reason why many of the saints are aesthetics and say that we need to withdraw from the material creation isn't because they think material creation is bad. It's to remove these distortions and distractions so that we can actually begin to marvel at existence, marvel at the created order, and read the book of creation correctly. That will be the beginning of like true faith and love.
Well, for me, I'm not sure if I can articulate it correctly, but for me, I feel like to get to that point, you have to break down yourself. Because for me, when I'm also like Nat, not really in church, but there was this whole idea that nature was something for us to dominate, to control, and because of that, I didn't have to wonder. There was no wonder involved in the way I looked at like the things you're saying, a line of ants, a babbling brook, and none of this mattered. It was like, okay, a babbling brook, how can I dam it and make power from it? Yeah. These are the kinds of things. And so for me, it seems like one of the first things you have to do is kind of break down. I don't know if it would be the ego, the self. What do you think on that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that I'm not really educated in like the sort of language of talking about the ego, but talking about the self is more my realm. But yeah, self-interest and the goals the partial goals that we subjectively set for ourselves without reflecting on, in general, are those things good for anybody, for not just for us. I think that part of you, your subjectivity and your ego and your individual self doesn't have to die and go away, but it has to be subjected and whipped and broken to the point where you yourself now see yourself as equal with other people, and especially, and as part and integrated into God's creation, and not, essentially like a hedonist where you put your own self-interest above everything else. And for most of us, frankly, that is how we are. again, I think the evangelical worldview tends to be extremely hedonistic and selfish, in that the church, or that the evangelical church, or some sort of in-group, or even the individual self and your own salvation are prioritized above everything else. And that has to be broken. Gosh, you guys are bringing up so many points. I could say so much from what each of you are saying, but Heidegger, who I talk about in the footnotes of my book a little bit, was really big on that. Essentially, the technological revolution of the modern age, what it does is that it fundamentally obscures the true nature of reality by manipulating the natural world to reveal it as a mere tool made in our image. Because we subject the natural world to our desires, our goals, our individual or human anthropocentric ends, that we essentially fashion nature so as to reveal its potential as just a mere tool, something that can be used and discarded. And really, ultimately, the materialist way of seeing the world is that everything's really just energy. Not in the sense of energy as something that exists, but it's just, you can quantify everything and how useful it is for doing some sort of work or reaching some sort of goal. And that's all we care about, is like treating all of the reality around us as quantifiable in terms of reaching some end, doing some amount of work, right? And then at the same time, if I'm remembering this right, because I'm trying to keep a straight line of thought on no sleep, the other thing that you just brought up is the movies of Andrei Tarkovsky, who's the Eastern Orthodox filmmaker from the Cold War period. All of his movies essentially feature on this truth of there's no hope for the individual to achieve a sort of enlightenment unless they first either choose to let go of their self and their ego, or suffering in life breaks you to the point where you realize that you're not the end all be all of everything. And that moment is when your actual life starts. And that was a big influence on me too, is looking at how that concretely plays out in his films. But then going back to someone like St. Isaac the Syrian, that I cover in my book a lot, and looking at that same sort of message there of the reason why suffering can be so precious in someone's life is because it decenters them. It makes you aware that you're not going to be around forever, that your pleasure is something that's fickle and unreliable, and that until maybe you get really lucky and are automatically capable of letting go of yourself in that way and your ego, but for most of us, until you suffer and truly are shown that you're just a blip in cosmic history, you're not able to get towards that broader vision of love for the cosmos, including yourself. As Hegel said, the second you make something purely subjective, you strip all value of it. And so if you end up seeing even yourself as completely in a subjective light, you've basically devalued yourself too, which is something that I talk about a lot in the book as well.
It's interesting because it also to me sounds very Buddhist.
Yeah.
Because I've been able to come to terms and the ability to reach my mindfulness through Buddhism, and this idea of suffering is a very Buddhist thought as well. So it's all very interesting to me. Everything you're saying, it's kind of mind-boggling too at the same time.
Oh, I was just curious how all of everything that you wrote, all that you've learned, all the people that you've studied over the years, like how has that impacted your relationship with God? Like how do you move in your relationship with God, or how does it even impact your relationships with other people?
Oh God, that's a horrible question because I'm kind of a piece of shit.
How do you see yourself?
Yeah, I mean, man, I'm not great at loving all things. I think, I hate saying it, but like I'm a little bit further along than I was, and that some other people I know, and that I have more love in my heart for things. But for me, what I'm writing and what I'm communicating is an ideal that I haven't quite experienced in myself yet. And I'm not very good at it. I'm very personally prone to anger and frustration, not prone to patience and love very much. So I think through considering these things and looking at the models in the Bible and in the saints, also, as John was mentioning, other spiritual traditions say a lot of the same things too. And I don't think that's just a random thing. I think that's because if there really is a spiritual truth, people who are actually devoted to finding it will be helped and pushed along towards actually finding it. I wouldn't want to be exclusivistic about these types of things. But as I've kind of gone down the intellectual path of considering it from the purely intellectual side, it's opened me up more emotionally and spiritually to actually having my emotions softened, my heart softened towards other people, my heart softened towards certain parts of the animal kingdom that I hated or detested before. I've always loved nature and animals, but I've always really been scared of things like spiders and stuff. And over the last couple of years, I've just it's helped me actually force myself to love spiders more. And I'm now no longer really afraid of picking them up and playing with them and not killing them. And I know that seems like a trivial example, but my relationship with the natural world is certainly more loving than it was. And I try to practice more ethical eating habits like vegetarianism and stuff like that. Although, again, I'm not good at it. It's
I'm just saying, I get the ideal, but I love a good hamburger.
I know, me too.
But the other thing I think though that comes from and suffering, man, it's a tough topic. Sometimes just the inherent unfairness of it. Some people seem to have a lot more opportunity to practice this than others. But when you talk about how do I become a more loving person, or one of the ways that has sadly worked for me is suffering. I mean, if you have a smidgen of self-awareness, you can't go through something horrific or go through some tragedy and not come out of it unchanged. We spent a lot of time with my daughter in the hospital several years ago, and she's very sick. And man, I tell you what, my heart breaks for people with dealing with life-threatening illnesses. Whereas before that, I would have been compassionate. I'm sure I would have said, "Oh man, I'm so sorry. Thoughts and prayers." And now I'm crushed for you because I've done it. I've sat in that space and lost hope, and I've sat in that place and felt like God was absent. And I'm like, holy shit, I don't want that for you. So there's that. There's some of that just comes from being alive. I think suffering has a great deal to do with that, though. That's one of the reasons I don't trust people who haven't suffered. How I don't trust a 20-something-year-old kid preaching who what the hell? I mean, life has been really good to you. Come back after it's kicked you in the nuts a few times, and maybe you've experienced some loss and you've had some perspective on the people that you're preaching to aren't living the same life you're living, and maybe that's critical, but it is just, I know that about myself. I was of no use to anyone at 25. Come on, man. I mean, I could flip a good hamburger, but I wasn't. Sorry, now you got me thinking about hamburgers. Damn it. And it wasn't even your fault. I brought them up. It's my fault.
Yeah.
But does that make sense? Hungry. I mean, not trying to. I mean, I guess on one hand, trying to make sense of suffering, or at least trying to find, could there be an outcome from this that is beneficial? I mean, you can lament the event and still go, yeah, but out of this came this. And that's growth, at least. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So and this ties into Bethany's question too, how it's personally impacted me. There's a difference between having compassion and even a sort of empathy for people and recognize that what they're going through is bad and sad. And then actually the sadness of it, of the loss that's involved in someone dying or being sick, being real to you in a way that it deeply moves you, is something that I've become much better at through I would say through suffering, then also paired with kind of the intellectual reflection on this stuff that's kind of paired nicely with my suffering to produce a more open, soft heart. I had a lot of health problems as a little kid. And then when I was 20 years old, I had a horrible immune system shutdown because I had lupus that was undiagnosed. And I spent most of my early 20s suffering and being really sick. And I look back now and am extremely grateful for those things and would not take that suffering back at all, because it really did open my heart up to other people. And then it put me down a road of studying and spiritually meditating on, frankly, meditating on how I lack the compassion and pity I had for myself. I lack that for other people in worse situations. It kind of took me out of myself in that way. And I think some of my writing, that suffering and life experience has culminated to make me, in general, a nicer person. I could give concrete examples of ideologically, I'm not at all right-wing conservative anymore like I was when I was younger. And I would be a fairly radical leftist, I think, from most American evangelical standards. But politically, and in the sorts of movements I'd support, and in the sorts of things I want to teach my students to advocate for, it would just be an ethic of love and compassion, those sorts of things. So I think it's made me a lot softer, better person over the last 10 years, but work still in progress. Majorly.
No, you're in good company. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Very, very.
Everybody on this screen would say, yeah, I think I'm with you though. I'm moving in the right direction. I overheard my daughter. She was, matter of fact, I was having a conversation with my son-in-law and taking him to Austin to see my daughter because he had to work. Anyway, long story short, we're having this long conversation. We got 3 hours in the truck, and I don't know how we just got on the topic of parenting and stuff. And I'm trying to give him pearls, man, because he has one and he's about to have another one on the way. And I'm like, and he said, yeah, my daughter Elena had told him, I don't think you would have liked my parents growing up, but they're much different now, And I'm like, you know what? I take that as a great compliment. And I told him, you know what? She's probably right. We were pretty, we were 20-something-year-old kids who didn't have a fucking clue what we were doing. And we were parenting off the information we had and doing the best we could with it. And we loved our kids, but there's things I would take back and things I wouldn't do that way again. If you listen to me, I'll help you avoid those pitfalls. The bottom line is you're going to fuck your kids up. We all do. We can all limit the depths of that fuck-uppery. We don't have to just, what I'm saying? We're going to, nobody gets out of this thing unscathed. Every parent makes mistakes, but that's my growth. I think my growth is the person I am at 52 is not the guy I was at 25, and I live in West Texas, man. Let me tell you what, I am a flaming liberal by most people's standards. and I feel like I'm pretty moderate, and I am absolutely radical leftist. I have to keep my mouth shut 99% of the time around the people I work with because they would just lose their ever-loving minds.
Yeah. I lived in Oklahoma for a long time.
Yeah, I'm deep in the heart of Trump country, baby.
Oh, yeah. That was tough.
Yeah.
When I started advocating the idea, I started writing this book and having discussions with people at my churches about this content in Oklahoma. And it was basically at one point I had a priest, when I was a catechumen in the Orthodox Church, he withheld chrismation and membership for me because he thought I was a communist.
Oh, no.
And it was okay, yeah, that's really not a great church.
So first of all, what if I am? I can't be a Christian and a communist?
Yeah, exactly.
Come on, man.
Yeah.
I was listening to Richard Rohr once at a festival I was at, and he was saying it's so easy for our brains to fire no towards people immediately. When we see a stranger, when we see even our kids sometimes or our family members, when we see them, our brain goes no. And he was inviting us to put on a practice of literally saying yes when you see somebody walking down the street, when you see somebody pouring your coffee, when you see the Trump supporter, when you see whoever it is, you say yes to who they are, and you say yes to yourself, not in some sort of like, obviously if there's mental illness and narcissism or something like that, it can get a little tricky, but just seeing that person for who they are, not for their behaviors, it adds value to them, even if you never even interact with them at all. And it changes something. It changed me when I started living like that. And it like shifted my own perspective on other people. Just like an audible yes is so helpful for me.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like a very basic thing, but just being able to, this is something that's particularly like relevant to like the trans rights issues and stuff going on right now, is just to whatever you think about all the nuances of gender identity, to be able to see somebody that's very different from what you grew up with in a conservative culture and just go, yeah, yes. Like, not necessarily, I'm not saying necessarily affirming everything about the very messy philosophy of gender identity going on right now, but to be able to fundamentally look at every human being and go, inherently good, inherently beautiful, inherently valuable. That should be our primary response to things, not these temporary gender expressions, these temporary, even our biological sex in the Christian tradition is something that's ultimately temporary too. And our reproductive roles and stuff like that. Seeing the human being as a beautiful, good, inherently good and dignified reality should be the thing that's first. I guess I'll add that to the second edition of the book, Bethany.
There you go. I like
walk down the street and say,
perfect.
Nice.
So what you're saying is not instant outrage.
Yeah.
And it's like, I like what Matt,
yeah, exactly.
I stole Matt DeStefano's, he did this little, anyway, his thing he put up on his Facebook post, like, dear Christian, you were supposed to be hated for loving too much, not for being completely insufferable.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, because that's what it has turned into. We are insufferable. I mean, it is the most knee-jerk. This Olympics has driven me crazy.
I know.
And it's not like there's not here's the thing. There are things worth being outraged over. There is a convicted child rapist competing in the Olympics that somehow is getting a pass from, well, not from everybody, and we're pissed off about, somebody we misperceived as being trans or being whatever. Yeah. And I'm seeing a lot of my more progressive Christian friends lose their minds over this. And I'm like, man, there are things that are worth getting outraged over. And you are diluting all of that with all of this feigned outrage over whatever it is. You're just like the grumpy old guy yelling, get off my lawn. Because you didn't take the 5 seconds it took to Google something and actually get to the bottom of it. But, I think that's the way forward, man. The idea, this notion of seeing inherent worth. And I think that is the paradigm shift. I really do think, I know I'm sure I'm oversimplifying it, but if you compare that to the version of Christianity most of us were brought up with, even going to, go back to Martin Luther and, we're all just snow-covered dung. Go back as far as Calvin and, what's the first T in tulip is total depravity. And so we were raised to think from the get-go we were broken and we were wrong. And even when we were fixed, I was always taught that like Jesus, God would see me through these lenses where he would no longer see me, he would see Jesus. And so now, even in the redemptive state, I'm still something that has to be overlooked. To see the goodness in me, I have to have this costume on. And I'm like, that cannot be more starkly different than the way I view the world now. And that I agree. If that's where this new paradigm is going, then I'm 100% on board. Human beings are inherently good, and whatever wrong we have going on has to do not with offending a holy and righteous God, but has to do with not seeing ourselves that way. And so we interact with God inappropriately, I think.
Well, and you see with Jesus, he was very critical of the Pharisaical movement that was unjust and deceptive and manipulative in many ways, but never about them themselves. He saw their intrinsic worth and that they were stuck in a way of seeing the world that they felt like they had to carry that. But it's true. Like we can be critical of systems and institutions that are manipulative and hypocritical, while also seeing the real flesh and blood people for the beautiful people they are.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, the classical Christian view of evil as privation. Evil's not something that positively exists as a being, but is beings falling apart and falling into disrepair, or literally disintegrating, or like disintegrating, falling apart. And the cosmos as a whole, and the good processes that go on getting out of whack. There is no such thing as an evil person or evil being on that sort of view. There's only evil, dysfunctional actions and out of whack, unhealthy things that we invite into ourselves and sadly propagate generationally too, like racism and systemic inequality, things like that. So yeah, no, I think that's ultimately where the paradigm's going. And sometimes, again, like I've said multiple times throughout this interview, like I read my book, I'm like, this is baby level crap. Why does anyone need the first 4 chapters? And then I realized, every semester I teach a philosophy class and an ethics class, not a single student has ever heard of the term intrinsic or inherent value. They've never been taught to think of the inherent goodness of things. Like people actually just don't know this simple, fundamental philosophical concept that is universal to everything but nihilism. Like people just don't know. They don't even know to take a minute and think about the inherent goodness of someone or something. And because we are, for the most part, don't actually have free will in most of our lives, we're kind of going through the motions and are very determined by our cultural context. Like, unless someone steps in and slows you down and be like, think about inherent goodness. To me, it seems like a baby level thing, but just that itself can change somebody's life.
Absolutely. Man, you run out of free will and we're out of time. But all right, so we need to come back. We can do an hour. We can do an hour on free will.
Yeah.
Because that's a bunch of bullshit. I've been, anyway, yeah. I forget I mentioned it. But man, I tell you what, I have appreciated and enjoyed the conversation, man. Thank you so much for hanging out. The book, again, A New Way of Seeing, is out. Is that correct? Or is it?
Yes. Yeah.
It is currently available. So I highly encourage y'all to get a copy. Go to your local bookstore if you can. If you can't, then go online, I guess, and do what you got to do. But let's just face Bezos will get his pound of flesh one way or the other. But
Bezos will get his money, sadly. Yeah.
But I tell you what, to me, it's a conversation that really needs to be had. And so I appreciate you doing the work and putting that out there, man. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing with us.
Thanks for having me on, for being willing to talk about it. And, I just appreciate a platform at all.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.